All right. Welcome to another narration of mine. Settle in for a moment. Only the brave souls and the fearless ones stay until the end. I'm going to keep this as anonymous as possible because the NDAs I signed back in 2014 are the kind that don't just sue you, they end you. I worked as a high-resolution LiDAR technician for a subcontractor hired by a special interest group. We weren't there for history. We were there for data. When people talk about the pyramids, they talk about the how. How did they move the stones? How are they aligned with the stars? That's all a distraction. The real question is what? During a deep scan survey of a lesser-known site near the Dashur area, our equipment started hitting a massive interference pocket. The lead researcher told us it was just high iron content in the bedrock, but the readings we were getting weren't metallic. They were organic. Not alive organic. More like a massive subterranean graveyard of biological material that had been chemically preserved in a way that defied every law of decomposition. We spent 3 weeks drilling a core sample. When the drill bit came back up, the entire site was shut down within 20 minutes. The bit wasn't covered in sand or limestone. It was coated in a thick, black, tar-like substance that smelled exactly like a mixture of ozone and old, stagnant blood. I managed to snag a look at the high-res internal imaging before the suits confiscated the server drives. What lay beneath the pyramid wasn't a tomb or a treasure room. It was a factory floor. The images showed thousands of shapes. They weren't grays or anything from a movie. They were horrific, asymmetrical husks, creatures that looked like they had been stitched together from different species, including humans. They were laid out in perfect, geometric rows, fused together by a resin that looked like dried industrial waste. But here's the detail that keeps me awake at night. The stones of the pyramid weren't just stacked on top of this place. The LiDAR showed that the base of the pyramid actually had roots. These weren't architectural supports. They were hollow tubes, thousands of them, extending from the base of the pyramid directly into the spinal columns of the thousands of bodies buried in the limestone below. The pyramids weren't built as monuments. They were built as massive, stone-capped biological processors. The builders didn't use tools. They used us. They used the local population as raw material, stripping them down to their basic biological components to grow the structures from the ground up. The stones we see today are just the hardened, calcified shells left over from a process that used human bone and blood as a binding agent. I saw a photo of a section they excavated in secret. There was a wall where you could clearly see the outline of dozens of human faces pressed into the material, their mouths open, in a silent, permanent scream, used as mere insulation for whatever was happening inside. It wasn't ancient technology. It was a slaughterhouse disguised as a wonder of the world. So, after the suits cleared out the LiDAR data, they didn't send us home. They couldn't. We had already seen the roots in the scans, so they figured it was cheaper to keep us working than to risk us talking. They moved our team to a secondary extraction point, a shaft that had been cleared out by a private security team. This wasn't a tunnel. It was a vertical pit, about 80 feet deep, lined with that same black, resin-like gunk. They lowered us down in industrial cages. The further down we went, the colder it got. But it wasn't a refreshing cold. It was a damp, heavy chill that made your skin feel oily. When we hit the bottom, the flashlights revealed the processing pits. Imagine a swimming pool, but instead of water, it's filled to the brim with human teeth and hair. Just piles of it. No bones, no flesh. Those had been used for the structural parts I mentioned earlier. This was the waste. The aliens, the builders, weren't interested in our culture or our souls. They saw humans as a specific type of resource. They needed the calcium from our bones to create the limestone-like casing of the pyramids. And they needed the iron from our blood to conduct whatever energy they were pulling from the ground. But they had no use for the keratin. I stepped out of the cage, and my boot crunched. I looked down, and I wasn't standing on dirt. I was standing on a layer of human jawbones, thousands of them, all stacked neatly like bricks. It wasn't messy. That's the most disturbing part. It was clinical. It was an assembly line. We found a sorting table. It was a slab of that black material, about 20 feet long. There were grooves worn into the surface where bodies had been dragged across it for decades. Above the table, there were these hooks. They weren't made of metal. They looked like giant, sharpened fingernails hanging from the ceiling on translucent cords. One of the guys on my team, a younger guy named Leo, found a pile of rejects in the corner. It was a heap of children. They hadn't been processed yet because their bone density wasn't high enough. They were just tossed aside like spoiled meat. They were preserved in that same black resin, so they looked like they had died yesterday. You could still see the fear in their eyes. They weren't wrapped in linen. They were just raw. That's when we realized the aliens didn't come from the stars to teach us math. They came here to harvest. The Great Pyramid isn't a tomb for a pharaoh. It's a massive, dried-out square over a site where millions of people were liquidated. While we were documenting the pits, Miller, my supervisor, found a small metallic object embedded in one of the jawbones. It wasn't Egyptian. It was a small, vibrating disc that looked like it was made of liquid mercury. As soon as he touched it, the hooks on the ceiling started to descend. Not because they were alive, but because the proximity of a living body triggered the machinery. We had to watch as those hooks, silent and precise, started swinging toward us, looking for the exact points on a human body where the skin is thinnest. We scrambled back into the cage, but I saw one of the hooks snag Leo's sleeve. It didn't just tear the fabric. It sliced through his arm like it was hot butter, not even meeting resistance. No blood came out. The hook itself seemed to cauterize or sip the wound instantly. We got out, but I can still hear the sound of those teeth crunching under my boots. It sounds like dry leaves, but you know exactly what it is. After the incident with Leo's arm, the site was placed under a Level 5 medical quarantine, but it was a total front. They didn't take him to a hospital. They took him to a temporary structure we called the clean room near the base of the pyramid. I managed to slip past the guard one night because I had to get my logbook from the office next door, and the door to Leo's unit was cracked open. I wish I hadn't looked. Leo was on a table, but he wasn't being treated for a wound. They had him hooked up to one of those liquid mercury discs we found in the pit. His skin was turning the color of wet ash. The most disturbing thing wasn't his arm. It was his face. It was like his features were being smoothed out. His nose was almost gone, just flat skin, and his mouth had been sealed shut by that black resin. He was breathing through his ears. I'm not joking. The skin behind his ears was fluttering like a fish's gills. I realized then that the builders didn't just kill people. They converted them. The next day, we were ordered to go back down, but this time into the central core. This is the part of the pyramid the public never sees because it's not made of stone. It's a vertical shaft that goes deep into the earth, lined with a material that looks like layers of pressed, dried skin. As we descended, the air got thick. It felt like walking through invisible cobwebs. We reached a chamber that was filled with what I can only describe as meat lockers. There were hundreds of these translucent, bladder-like bags hanging from the ceiling. Inside each one was a human being, but they weren't whole. They had been stripped of their skin and most of their muscle. They were just skeletons held together by a network of glowing blue veins that weren't part of human anatomy. These veins were plugged into the floor. The people inside, some of them were still blinking. Their eyes were wide, staring at nothing, pupils blown out. They were being used as biological relays. I saw one bag that was newer than the others. The person inside still had their clothes on. It was a desert trekker's outfit. A tourist who must have gone missing months ago. The roots of the pyramid were slowly growing into his eye sockets, weaving into his brain. The purpose of this place became clear. The pyramid is an antenna, but it's powered by human suffering. Not magic suffering, but the actual electrical impulses of a nervous system in extreme, permanent distress. They weren't just killing these people, they were keeping them in a state of perpetual, high-intensity pain, because that specific bioelectrical output was what the antenna needed to broadcast. I looked up at the ceiling of the chamber and saw where the wires went. They all converged into a single massive pillar of bone that shot straight up through the center of the pyramid toward the capstone. We weren't looking at a tomb. We were looking at a long-distance transmitter that had been running on the battery power of kidnapped humans for thousands of years. And the scariest part? The bags at the bottom were empty. They were waiting for a fresh harvest. Miller leaned over to me and whispered, "They aren't from another planet, kid. They've been here longer than we have. We're just the livestock they grew to keep the lights on." Then, the lights in the chamber didn't flicker. They inhaled. The air pressure dropped so fast, our ears popped, and a sound like 1,000 wet voices whispering at once started coming from the walls. After the air pressure dropped and that whispering started, we didn't wait for orders. We scrambled back to the lift. But the thing about these structures is that they aren't static. The stone doesn't just sit there. When the antenna is active, the dimensions of the hallways seem to warp. What should have been a 30-second walk back to the cage took us 10 minutes. As we ran, we passed the recycling pits. This is where the stuff that's too worn out to be a battery goes. I saw a pile of what looked like oversized leather jackets dumped in a corner. It took me a second to realize they weren't jackets. They were human skins, perfectly removed in one piece, stacked like discarded rags. They had no further use for the exterior. They only wanted the nerves and the marrow. We finally made it back to the surface, but the clean room where Leo had been was gone. Not demolished, gone. There was just a flat patch of scorched sand where the building had stood. Miller was shaking so hard, he couldn't even light his cigarette. He pulled me behind one of the supply trucks and showed me a tablet he'd managed to swipe from the central hub before we bolted. The tablet was running a live feed of the signal output. It wasn't a bunch of math or coordinates. It was a frequency map of the Earth's crust. The pyramids, all of them, not just Giza, but the ones in Mexico, China, underwater. They're all connected by a subterranean network of those bone veins. The aliens didn't build these things to talk to a home planet. They built them to manage the herd here. The signal being broadcast from the capstones is a low-frequency pulse designed to keep human brainwaves in a specific, docile state. It's a pacification broadcast. It's why we, as a species, have been so easy to control for thousands of years. We aren't being visited. We're being farmed in a controlled environment. But here's the most disturbing part. Miller pointed to a red line on the graph that was spiking. "The batteries are hitting critical failure," he said. "The human tissue they harvested 5,000 years ago is finally degrading past the point of use. The binding agent, the blood and bone in the walls, is turning to dust." He showed me a photo taken by a drone inside the king's chamber that hasn't been released to the public. The granite blocks are cracking, and leaking out from the cracks is this gray, powdery ash that used to be people. The structure is failing, and when a structure like this fails, the builders don't just fix it. They restock. While we were looking at the tablet, a black SUV pulled up. 2 guys in tactical gear stepped out, but they weren't military. They didn't have patches, and their skin had that same smoothed-out look I saw on Leo. They didn't use weapons. They just stood there, and the air around them started to vibrate. I watched Miller's nose start to melt. I don't know how else to describe it. His cartilage just softened and started to drip down his face while he was still standing there, staring at me with wide, terrified eyes. He couldn't scream because his jaw had already fused shut. I ran. I didn't look back. I grabbed a motorbike and drove until I hit the main highway, and I haven't stopped moving since. I'm currently in a motel in a city I won't name, but I can feel it. The pulse. It's not a sound. It's a throb in the back of my skull. It's getting louder because the pyramids are hungry again. They need fresh material to rebuild the walls. They need new nervous systems to power the broadcast. And the scouts are already out there looking for the most dense concentrations of humans. I've been moving every 12 hours. I don't use my phone anymore. I'm typing this on a public library computer. My skin feels tight, like it's being pulled towards something, and my teeth have started to ache with a constant, rhythmic throb. It's the broadcast. It's picking up speed because the restocking has officially begun. I found the last bit of data on Miller's tablet before I smashed it and threw it into a canal. The Great Harvest isn't a war or an invasion. It's much more efficient than that. The pyramids are basically giant vacuum sealers for biological matter. Once the structural integrity of the old bone concrete fails completely, the capstones initiate a high-frequency resonance. This resonance does something to human physiology at a molecular level. It's called liquefaction of the spirit. But that's just a fancy way of saying it turns your internal organs into the raw slurry they need to grow new stone. I saw a video file on that tablet. It was recorded in a village near the Red Sea. It wasn't a shining light or a tractor beam. The people there just stopped. They stood perfectly still in the street. Then their skin started to turn translucent. You could see their skeletons through their flesh. And then their bones started to elongate and twist, snapping and reforming into those jagged roots I saw in the pits. They weren't being taken away. They were being turned into the building materials right there on the spot. Within an hour, the entire village was gone, replaced by a series of small, jagged, limestone-like mounds. The people were still inside, their nervous systems stretched out to form a local relay for the signal. The aliens aren't coming from space. They are already here, underneath us, waiting for the signal to hit the right pitch. They've been maintaining the livestock for millennia, and we just hit the expiration date. The most disturbing part? The suits I worked for? They aren't even humans trying to save themselves. They're drones, people who have already been processed and had their brains replaced with that mercury-like liquid. They are the managers of the slaughterhouse. They are the ones who make sure the slurry stays at the right temperature. As I'm sitting here, I can see a black SUV idling across the street. There are 2 men inside. They haven't moved for 3 hours. They're just waiting. They don't need to chase me. They know the signal is going to reach the critical harvest frequency any minute now. When it happens, it won't be painful. At least, not in the way we think. You'll just feel a sudden warmth, like a fever. Your skin will start to feel oily. You'll look at your hands and see the bones shifting under the surface, turning into white, calcified rebar. You'll try to scream, but your mouth will already be sealed by the resin. You'll be conscious for the whole thing. You have to be. The pyramids need the electrical energy of your terror to stay powered. You'll become a part of the wall, a living battery, staring out from behind the stone for the next 5,000 years, watching the next herd grow until it's their turn to be harvested. If you're reading this and your nose starts to bleed, or you hear a low humming in your ears that sounds like 1,000 wet voices, it's already started. Don't bother running. You're just a brick in someone else's house. I can feel my jaw tightening now. The air smells like copper and bleach. They're coming in.